Hey guys, it's Ice here. This video is going to be a blade restoration video. This is a handmade sword from Ghana. It belongs to one of my friends. I'm just restoring it for him. It's got a bit of rust on it. It's not a stainless steel. It's pretty thin, so it's bent up a little bit. And it also has no edge. It's just a flat piece of steel. It's not sharp whatsoever. So I'm going to be putting an angle on it and then sharpening it, and then I'm going to be derusting it and straightening it out with a clamp. So here I'm just using this porous block. It's called a derusting block, and I got it when I was a fencer. We used this on our blades to prevent rust from eating out the very thin blades. So one block will last you a very, very long time. It's basically like kind of like a sandpaper. Just kind of rubs the rust off without damaging the metal. It does take off a finish. If the blade has a finish on it, it'll take off whatever it has, whether that be, bead blast or titanium nitride or even like a powder coat. Really anything, any finish it has on there, even like satin finish or polish, will take it off, unfortunately. But most of the blades that have a finish won't rust anyways, so. And if it does, then that finish doesn't even deserve to be on the blade anyways, so. So here I'm just polishing up this front face of the blade, just getting the individual spots and wiping it off. Make it nice and smooth. Doing this while the motor on my sharpener takes a break. I don't have before and after pictures of this, of the full blade, but there was quite a bit of rust on this when I started. It's looking pretty good right now. It's good to kind of get a general sweep and focus on the little parts and sweep it off again. Because if you just get the parts that are rusted, the blade turns up all spotty and doesn't look very good. Very important in blade restoration to keep consistency. And it's not actually taking off any steel. This doesn't have any like carbide or diamond stone in it. It's just porous derusting block. It's spongy and it flexes, so it doesn't have the capability of taking off any of the steel. Just getting off whatever is on top of the steel, whether that be rust or the finish. Also, when you're doing this, you want to try to stay away from the edge, the sharp edge of the blade, because not only can it take off like some of the polish on the edge, but it can also cut your block, which is never good. You want this to last as long as you can. You also want to make sure that when you're derusting, you're rubbing in the same direction as the blade. Never want to rub this way. Think of it as when you're sanding wood, you always sand in the direction of the grain. Same thing with the blade, because not that steel has grain in any particular direction, it's just that the deruster, when it takes off polish, it'll leave streaks. And if you have all these multi-directional streaks, it looks really bad. You just keep it always in the same direction down the blade. Doesn't matter who does it in the future. They know exactly which way they need to go. Keep it looking nice. And wherever there's dark spots, even if it's not full-on rust, if there's dark spots, then you're going to want to hit those a little harder. Make sure it looks clean. And it's not just about the look either, because rust does not come with consistency. Different parts of the blade will rust at different times, and so if you just take off the rust, then you'll get these little craters in the blade where the rust eats away and you break off the rust. The rust eats more in that same spot and you break off the rust, and it becomes this Swiss cheese kind of blade, very minutely, tiny little craters. So you want to get everything equally, get the rust first, get everything down to that same level. Polish. It's also good to do this before resharpening the blade or putting a new angle or edge on it, simply because you don't have to worry about hitting that edge as much, about cutting your block or damaging it. When I started, this blade had no angle. It was just a flat piece of steel. This doesn't even have a sharp edge on it, it's just angles on either side and they haven't met yet. So it's not capable of cutting the block yet. Alright, so that's just about it for the derusting. Looks pretty good. Far less rust on this than when I started. So for the sharpening, we're going to be using the Work Sharp knife and tool sharpener. I normally would just sharpen by hand with diamond or carbide stones. However, this blade is way too big for any of my stones. If you get diamond or carbide stones, if you get big ones, they're usually very expensive. So with the larger stones, it's easier to get synthetic stones. Then it's also a very long process of grinding away at it like that by hand. The longer the blade, the longer it's going to take, especially with no edge. So I'm using the Work Sharp knife and tool sharpener, which has a spinning belt on it. I would highly recommend this tool for sharpening literally anything from pocket knives to lawnmower blades. You can do anything, and it puts a nice convex edge on it. Basically you just pull this trigger here and swipe the blade through those angle guides. I've got a 20-degree angle guide on this, and I'm just going to be running it through a whole lot of times with the coarse belt to try and get it down to an edge. So here we go. As you can see, it's putting a nice polish on that edge. So once this gets down to the angle, it's going to get really sharp. Once those angles meet, at the moment there's still the dull steel in between those two angles. Gotta whittle that down as much as possible. So when I started this blade, the edge that I'm working on right now was no sharper than the back of the blade right here. It was the same thing on both sides. You can tell how far I've gotten with the Work Sharp. There's a lot of work to get it down to a sharp angle. It's doing a very good job of it. And when using the Work Sharp, you want to make sure to never just leave the blade in there just grinding, because if you don't take it out periodically, the friction will build up so much heat that it could actually damage the heat treatment on the blade, lower the Rockwell hardness. You want to make sure to just always slide it through and stop once you get out. And normally you're supposed to alternate which side every stroke, but it's not as vital right here simply because I'm putting a new angle on it, not just putting a new edge. So when using the Work Sharp, don't be alarmed if sparks fly or if the steel starts screeching. That's fairly natural, especially for a larger blade, because especially with the coarse belts, there's going to be a lot of steel coming off, a lot of friction. I don't know if you can see it in the camera very well, but there's been quite a few sparks. Don't be alarmed, that's supposed to happen. Hear it screeching pretty loud there. So to increase the convex effect of the edge, I started out with the blade pressed up against this far side of the angle edge to make a really acute angle, so it's less than 20 degrees. Then as I went on, I started pressing up against this part of the angle guide, digging the edge more into this belt to kind of create that curve effect a bit more effectively. I'll give you another look at the edge. Pretty close to being done right here. It's very, very difficult to get this slight of a convex edge on such a large blade with just stones, because it's very difficult as it is to retain the same angle every time, but to retain the same curve every time is even harder. So it's really nice to have this belt. So I'm pretty far along now. The angles are beginning to come together in some areas. This is where the slightly harder part of creating an edge comes in. When the angles start to meet unevenly, as you can see there, that spot, there's a little bit of the blade where there's no glimmer because the edge right here is meeting. And where there is that shine right there, you can see there's still some dull steel in between. If you were to just keep doing full strokes all along the blade, those areas, since they're lower, they would actually sharpen faster than the dull areas that need sharpening. So here's where you have to, instead of doing full strokes, just focus on the areas that need sharpening. Once they're all down to the same level, once all the angles have met, then you can start doing full strokes, polishing off the edge. So I'll show you a bit of what that looks like. And if you recall, I said before that you shouldn't focus on any one area too slowly. You should always be moving the blade. And what I'm doing here, although I'm going much slower than I was before, I'm still constantly moving the blade. I'm never holding it in the same place on the belt. So you still need to go slower to focus on those areas and really grind some more steel rather than just trying to polish an edge. But you have to make sure that the blade is never completely stopped. Since it's sharpened unevenly, then you're going to have to just do a few strokes all the way up and down the blade to finish off that edge. So now that the angles all over the blade have met, there's no more dull steel in between those angles. Now I can begin to polish off the edge, but first you want to make sure to grind out any inconsistencies, like this one right here. If you can see right about there, there's kind of that curve in the grind, but there's not a curve in the blade. So I want to make sure that the grind is even on all sides before polishing it off. Also, don't be afraid to use a new belt to exchange the same grit of belt. I'm pretty sure you can get 6 of these things for $10 off Amazon. So they're very cheap, and just exchanging to a new belt will help speed up the progress if you're trying to take off a lot of steel. So that looks about good for the highest grit belt. Now we can switch out the belt. After long grinding, you want to be careful when you're switching it out because this can get really, really hot. If it is hot, you can either wait for it to cool down, obviously, or you can just get it really fast, not hold your hand on it for too long. Just take that belt out. And then we're going to switch to this medium grit belt, which is the red one. So you just slide this in here. Make sure it's in the middle of those wheels. Rotate that, run it, and then just run it once to readjust it automatically. Put the guide back on, and you're good to go. Then you can continue with the medium grit, get that angle really sharp, and then we can polish it. And now that we are actually sharpening and not just grinding off mass amounts of steel, you want to make sure to be alternating which side each time, not be focusing so much on specific areas. So whenever you are sharpening, you want to make sure to finish on the left side of the belt sharpener. And the reason for that is that when the belt is turning, this side is going up, so that when you finish on that side, that's going to reduce the burr, and there's not going to be as much for you to polish off. So now we can go ahead and switch to the polishing belt, which is basically the same effect as stropping. When you sharpen a blade by hand, the last process is usually stropping with leather, which is to remove the burr and polish off the angle of that edge. And that is very, very important. If you don't strop the blade or if you don't polish it off, then what happens is you get these microscopic saw-like pieces coming off the edge of the blade that are very weak, and it's not a very smooth edge. And what happens is when you cut with that, then those little teeth kind of start to curl over, and it dulls the edge very quickly. So you want to make sure to remove that burr. It's a very, very important process. And just put the angle back on, angle guide, and this will only take a few strokes. This is definitely not as time consuming as the other two belts. So now that I'm done polishing, you can see that this edge is much smoother than it was before. That is a very good sign. It means that burr has been taken off, and if you still feel areas that are not as smooth as they could be, run it once or twice more. So there it is. This blade is now officially finished. Rust has been removed. The blade has been straightened out. It wasn't very bent up in the first place, so it wasn't very hard. I didn't actually have to use the clamp. And I have the new edge on it. This is a convex edge. A convex is basically an edge that curves down to the tip. And what that does is it makes the edge stronger so it doesn't chip or curl as easily. And also when you're cutting, there's less resistance. So when you have a flat grind like this, there's constant resistance when something is sliding down that edge. When you have a concave like that, there's even more resistance. But when you have a convex, it just cuts from the edge and then it passes. So it's not actually contacting the edge. So this is a tougher edge. It's not necessarily sharper. It cuts with less resistance and it will stay sharp longer. This is the completed project. This has been Ice. Thank you very much for listening.